Good evening to everyone. Welcome at the Center of Historical Research of the Polish Academy of Sciences at the book presentation, which is going to take place in our new series, which is called Triangle of Dialogue, Berlin, Prague, and Warsaw. And the Center for Historical Research Berlin of the Polish Academy of Sciences has the pleasure to organize this series together with the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, together with our friend and dear colleague, Professor Miłosz Rzeznik, who is joining us from Warsaw online. Actually, we are going to extend our triangle. Originally, we thought that we were going to organize a series of meetings taking place in the capitals of our three countries, in Germany, Berlin, the Czech Republic, Prague, and in Poland, in Warsaw. Nonetheless, our first guest and speakers coming to us from Hungary. So we are going to extend our format from the triangle to a rectangle. And we are going to start this series actually in Pécs, though, as I said, we are meeting today in Berlin. Andreas Sashalmi is going to present us his newest book. You can see the book in front of me. The book is called Russian Notions of Power and State in a European Perspective, 1462 to 1725, assessing the significance of Peter Reign. The book came out recently, 2022, at the Academic Studies Press in the United States. The title and the content is very topical, and I'm glad to present to all of you Professor Andreas Sashalmi, who is a professor of history at the Department of Medieval and Early Modern History at the University of Pécs in Hungary, but also he's a member of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences. He's
just doctor, not member.
Okay, so there is, I assume, a slight difference between member and doctor, not slight, right? Okay, but you are going to be a member anyway in the future. And his main fields of academic interest are comparisons of Western and Russian political thought and political iconography from the 15th to the 18th century, as well as the issue of state formation in Russia and in early modern Europe. We have one Professor Michal Müller, also our good friend and an excellent expert on East European history, who in the 1970s to the beginning of the 1990s was working at the universities of Frankfurt and Gießen, and in the 1990s he held the professorship of history of East Central Europe at the European University Institute in Florence since 1996 until his retirement. Michal Müller was professor of Eastern European history at the Martin Luther University Halle, Wittenberg, and he is one of the founders of the Alexander Brückner Center for Polish Studies. His research interest covers the political and constitutional history of Poland, Lithuania, and Russia from the 16th to the 19th centuries, and the history of German-Polish relations, as well as comparative social history of East Central Europe in modern times. And before we give the floor to Andre as the author of the book and Professor Michał Wymira as the commentator, I'd like to ask Professor Miloš Wężesnik, the director of the German Historical Institute in Warsaw, for his introduction and giving us some insight into our new series called again Triangle of Dialogue, Berlin, Prague, Warsaw. Miloš, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon or good evening, the guests, the participants, the Professor Sashalmi, the Michael, the Igor. Unfortunately, I'm not able to greet you, to welcome you in Berlin. I was the whole day in Poznań. Now I'm in Wrocław and then going to Warsaw. But I'm very glad that I can greet you from the screen. We joined with the CBH, no, so Center of Historical Research of the Berlin of the Polish Academy of Science, to launch a new series of of book presentations, of discussions, maybe sometimes of other kind of events, small workshops and so on, moving between the three Central European capitals. Maybe it's not excluded that one day it could take place at another place in Central Europe, and I think there is no paradox that I don't see any paradox in the fact that we have today a presentation of a book written by a Hungarian colleague on Russian history, because we are thinking about this dialogue in triangle, or multiple dialogue in a Central European or European context. So we are not focusing only on our region or on our three countries, but we can discuss, or we want to discuss or to deal, to consider our history of our region, or topics, problems of our region in a broader, not only historical context of Central Europe and as you can imagine, Russian history and historical preconditions from developing of the role of Russia in European history. You can imagine we are considering, we are thinking of this about this topic, or this problematic, more and more intensively in last two, unfortunately already almost two years. And so I'm very glad that we could find this topic for the very beginning of our series, because I'm glad, I'm happy also for another reason. So you can see we have a book on, not on contemporary history, but on the pre-modern history of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, that help us to understand also the contemporary times and contemporary problems. And that would be our ambition, not to concentrate only on contemporary history, last century, but to think in, I don't know exactly if longue durée is the proper notion, speaking of notions, the proper notion for this perspective, but such kind of historical perspective we would like to use for our discussions. And let me only mention the next one. We will meet with Igor in 4 days or 3-4 days in Prague and at the other place. And we are organizing it in the Goethe Institute in Prague, together with Goethe Institute Prague, discussion about the establishing new relations between Federal Republic of Germany and the eastern neighbors, so Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic then, and Poland after 1990s, so during the 1990s, because this year we have the 25th anniversary of the end of the era Helmut Kohl in German history, that gave a rise the rise for this idea. And we will meet with a couple of diplomats, with the last foreign minister of the German Democratic Republic and the first Polish ambassador in Germany after 1990, and the former Czech ambassador in Vienna and Berlin, and now in Bratislava. And we will discuss different questions, among them also the questions what is still relevant, what is still so the living actual heritage of the 1990s in our sometimes are problematic relations nowadays. So thank you for inviting me, at least in this form, and I wish you an interesting evening. I will be present in the background the whole time. Thank you.
Thank you, Milos, very much. And we are glad having you here. Please, if you could turn off your camera so we can get the full screen format now. Thank you. But as you said, you are staying with us. Before I'm going to give the floor to Andre, I'd like to mention and to say again that the subject we're going to discuss today is very topical, and it's obvious for all of us. But also because of the debate going on here in Germany on the book I'm holding now here in front of me, and most of you, I'm pretty sure, have read already this book. The book has been authored by Martin Schulze-Wessel, Der Fluch des Imperiums. So the curse of the Imperium, or Imperial Russia, the Ukraine, Poland, and the tortures way in the Russian history. We can try to translate the German title into English in this way. Though Martin Schulze-Wessel starts his book actually at the point where Andre ends his monograph. So the very last statement from me. I'm not going to give you any introduction to this book. Andre will do it by himself. But before we begin, or he begins, I'd like just to read a short review, actually a prize given by one of the experts on Russian history, that is the European history, Russell Martin, from his review of Andre's the book. And he wrote, quote, Andre Sashalmi has produced one of the most challenging books anyone can write, a work of synthesis that is at the same time a major reconceptualization of a set of complex themes. He argues that Muscovite political culture is a vitally important lens for understanding early modern Russia, affecting everything from the imperial succession to the nature of monarchical power to the very meaning of the Petruin reforms. Using a dizzying array of published primary and secondary sources in several languages, Sashalmi's book both summarizes where we are and moves us forward in our understanding of Russia and the entire Western Eurasian space. It's a learned and lucid reappraisal that must be considered by all those working on the early modern centuries. And I think this is a good introduction to your book presentation. So we are all ears, Andrea, the floor is yours.
Okay. Would you change it?
Yeah. Swoop. Seats.
Like this. Start with, I hope so.
And we need first to get
Okay.
into the presentation, just here.
Yeah.
Yeah, and now hopefully here we are. Okay.
Full screen.
Is it
Full screen.
Yeah, it is. It is. Okay.
Okay, okay. So first of all, I would like to thank for Professor Konkoleski for inviting me here and to give me the opportunity to present my book, to present my research, and likewise, I would like to express my gratitude to Professor Miller and Professor Resnick for taking their precious time to read this quite a long book and to be here to comment on my work. Before moving to the presentation of the book, let me say some words how this book was born. As in the preface, I make it quite clear that this is a very much extended version of a Hungarian book, which I wrote. I finished the manuscript in 2018. So I think it's quite important to know, and unfortunately, we all know why the book has become quite topical, as Igor remarked. But the Hungarian version of this book, the manuscript was produced in 2018. It came out in the print only in 2020. However, this book is a much shorter one. So, of course, for an international readership, practically I had to write another book. But I'm quite grateful for the National Public Service University at Budapest, which included me, and I have to mention the name of Professor Lajos Csékis, who led a team which researched the concept of the state, and this research went on from 2016 2018, and my book finally in 2020 was published in a series which is called Perceptions of the State. As for the English version, I think the book was published to a great extent by sheer luck, because also in 2018, when the Hungarian manuscript was finished, I was able to publish an article in Russian history, which is one of the leading periodicals, I think, in early modern Russian or pre-Petrine Russian studies. And in 2019, in the autumn, I got an unexpected email, namely from the director of the Academic Studies Press, who happened to read my article, and that was the beginning of our cooperation. So also I'm very grateful for the Academic Studies Press too. So moving to the presentation itself, some of the first, does it move, or maybe with this one? Okay, thank you very much. So the first slide might be overtly didactic, because of course I cannot take it for granted that you are familiar with the book or with some parts of the book through a podcast, which also has been published recently. And that's why I try to frame it very briefly. Sometimes these sentences are word by word quotation from the book itself. So I will try to concentrate on, as I write here, on the main features and trends, beginning from the reign of Ivan III and ending with the death of Peter the Great in 1725. And it is important to note that it's not a history of Russian political thought in a traditional sense, so to say. And in most part of the book, I try to avoid using the adjective political, because one reason for this was, as you can see there, that neither the word politics nor the concept or the word sovereignty or in the modern meaning the state were known in Russia most of the time with which the book deals with. So that was one reason that I avoid using the adjective political. And I also just wanted to concentrate on, so to say, enigmatic sources and authors. And most of the book is on the official perception of power. And I just slightly touched upon the, so to say, popular perception of monarchical or governmental power. And also, I put in the focus those authors or sources which marked important changes in the official perception of rulership. And one of the most important aims was that to show in what ways and to what extent did Russian perception of governmental power and state differ from the perception which prevailed in Western Christendom during this time. The second important point, since the title is Russian notions of power and state, that I also put in the focus those sources which pointed towards the depersonalization and the secularization of ruling power or rulership in Russia at large. And as I'm going to argue, of course, it goes without saying that depersonalization and secularization of rulership is a prerequisite for the emergence of the modern concept of the state, as it was the case in the West, of course, in the early modern period. And I tried to combine written and visual sources to highlight how perception of governmental power was reflected in not only in written sources, but how can we document and what is the relationship between visuality in the different periods, in Petrine period, in the Petrine period, with the relationship of written sources to visual sources. Okay, and finally, because there is an epilogue which makes it topical, I raised the question that does a long-term or longue durée approach, which goes further than the 18th century, have any relevance on account of certain continuity rooted in the period analyzed? And Professor Resnick mentioned the longue durée approach. I mean it in a sense to whom I refer in a book of David Armitage, that he raised the issue of serial contextualism, which means he speaks about or spoke about to put into the given context an idea, and that's why he spoke of not the history of ideas, but history in ideas. And I try to do it with, especially with the words gasudarstvo, because as we're going to see, it had very different meanings in the different times, although from the time of Peter the Great, from the early 18th century, roughly after 1700, more and more we can translate it as a state. And by the middle of the 18th century, it really acquired the meaning of the state in a Western sense. However, there were and there have remained certain differences in the Russian context. So in the presentation here, I try to concentrate on continuity and change. and of course try to concentrate on the persistent features of parent state, which would lead us to the epilogue, to the 20th, to the end of the 20th century, and to even to the 21st century at the end of the presentation. So I think one of the main the persistent features of Russian perception of power and state when государство came to mean state, as I mentioned roughly in the 18th century, was that governmental power was and is or has been identified or closely associated with the person wielding it, be the person a Tsar, or an emperor later, with Peter the Great, a party secretary, a wождь in the 20th century, or a president today. So let me give you some example of how this highly personalized perception of power was expressed in Muscovite times. Of course, in Moscow, as in the West, common ground was the Bible, but of course it is possible to make different conclusions from the different sentences of the Bible. And of course, one of the most important sentences pertaining to power in the Bible comes from St. Paul, the letter to the Romans, that there is no power but of God. But we have instances in the Muscovite period where this sentence was quoted erroneously, that there is no ruler but of God, which means that there was no distinction for a long time between power as such and the actual holder of that power. And one reason for that was, of course, the lack of Aristotelian logic in medieval and in early modern Russia in the period I dealt with. Here and there, I will refer to some important authors on whose research I relied on, and one of them was Marshall Pope. And he mentioned that in Moscow there was no talk of common good or common anything. And in fact, the first instance wherein the government document, the Russian terms common good, общее добро, comes up, came only in 1682. And also it was due to the fact that there was no distinction between private and public, because of the lack of Roman law in medieval and early modern Russia. And closely connected to that, which was very well highlighted by Marshall Poe, that the clergy said and the commoners believed that the Tsar was selected by the Lord not to hold the office of Tsar, but to be Tsar, which is important because the distinction between the person of the ruler and the office was vital for the emergence of the concept of the crown. That is the notion that the rights which are exercised by a given ruler can be detached from the ruler, so a distinction can be made between the rights as such and the person wielding or the person exercising the certain rights. And it was the concept of the crown was crucial for the modern concept of the state to be crystallized. And here some example from the 16th, 17th century that in which senses государство was used. It had various meanings in the 16th, 17th century. It could refer to the territory ruled by the Tsar, it could refer to the people or both, and in this sense it could mean a realm, it could mean the position of the ruler, it could mean a throne simply, and it could mean simply rule. So several meanings, and also we have to emphasize that the word государство was derived from the word государ, which was, besides the Tsar, the most important title of the Russian rulers up to the early 18th century. And the meaning of this Gasudar was roughly unlimited ruler. After 1700, and this time, about the turn of the 17th, 18th century, I consider important, the word Gasudarstvo more and more came to be used in a sense of a state, and there can be no doubt that by the middle of the 18th century, by some authors, it was used in a way that it was used in contemporary Western Europe. And we can raise the question, what happened to the title or the word Gasudar? In the 18th century, it more often came to be used in a general sense as a ruler. And what is important in this point, that from the early 18th century, the Russian, those authors who were responsible for forming establishing the new westernized ideology for Peter the Great, more and more used another word as a synonym of Gasudar, that is monarch. And this way, the meaning of the word Gasudarstvo was a little bit detached from the person of the ruler Gasudar, because of the use of the term, of the Western term monarch. In fact, the use of this term monarch was one side of westernization. Nevertheless, due to the fact that Gasudarstvo is derived from Gasudar, that's why not only in the 18th and 19th century, but I would say even up to our days, a strong personal connotation has been preserved in the word Gasudarstvo. And there is a good comparison, it's not on the slide, there is a good comparison when we compare Gasudarstvo with those terms which came to mean state in Western European languages, like the German Staat, or the English state, or the French État, or the Italian Stato. These words all derive from the Latin status, which had the meaning of rank, and it was closely associated, rank, status, and was closely associated with legality. The second important point I want to emphasize, which is a persistent feature, the unimportance attributed to legal, constitutional, and institutional limitations. And I would say that there was an indifference to these kind of limitations in Muscovy, but from the early 18th century, this indifference gave way to a kind of conscious denial of the use of this kind of limitations, either legal, constitutional, or institutional. And I would give an example in one of the forthcoming slides, a quotation for Nicholas Karamzin, who is one of the best examples to articulate this kind of thinking. So, as I mentioned before, in the Muscovite period, there was no such discourse, legal or philosophical discourse, which was available for those authors who gave the official ideology of the Tsar. So there was no discussion of what the best form of government is. There was no discussion of the mixed government, mixed monarchy. In a monarchy, mixed monarchy means that monarchy uniting the advantages of monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. There was no legal grounding of power. There was no such notion as fundamental law, which was used as a synonym of the constitution in the 17th, 18th century. And I find it crucial that there was no natural law reasoning at all, because there was no concept of natural law prior to the 18th century. A characteristic feature of Muscovite ideology, and here I rely on Simon Dixon, who mentioned that in both form and language, Muscovite ideology stands out because of the degree to which philosophical, and I added legal, abstractions remain foreign to it, and it is important, as also I mentioned, that the vocabulary of the sources was predominantly biblical in origin. So we can say, by and large, that the ruler's power was grounded in theology and was characterized by simplicity. Whereas in early modern Western Europe, huge theoretical treatises were written on sovereignty and buttressing royal power. Think of Hobbes or before that Bodden, for example, the 6 books of the Commonwealth. In the Muscovite period, and even later on, it was enough to refer to some biblical sentences. And this biblical sentence, that the heart of the Tsar is in God's hand, which comes from the Bible, from the book of Proverbs, was encountered in various sources of the 16th, 17th, and also in 18th centuries. But not only in the 18th century, but we can encounter in the 19th and early 20th century that I can conclude that from the 16th century up to the collapse of the Tsarist system, it was the cornerstone of the ideology of power. So, point 1 and point 2, that is the highly personal perception of power and the unimportance attributed to legal, constitutional, institutional limitations, fostered the belief of the good Tsar. In such sayings were recorded in the 16th, 17th century that the Tsar is good, the boyars are wicked. And the most important was that the idea of the good Tsar includes or entails a kind of direct relation of the Tsar with the people, so to say, an unmediated relationship between the Tsar and the people, in a sense that everyone had the right to not give personally, but until the mid-17th century, even personally, to give a petition to the Tsar, but to send or to write a petition to the Tsar so that the Tsar should deal with his problem. Of course, it was part of the lack of the institutional channels which could serve to articulate these problems and to deal with these problems by the rulers on the top. From 1700, roughly, early 1700, we have the situation during Peter the Great that legally unlimited power was buttressed by the formulae, however, without the idea of the rule of law. Certain important maxims of absolutist ideology were simply taken over. That is, the ruler is above the law, or whatever has pleased the ruler has the force of law. These were, of course, commonplaces of Western absolutist political thought, political ideology. But even absolutist thinkers like Bodden, for example, emphasized the importance of fundamental law. As I mentioned, the absolutist theorists emphasized that even an absolute ruler who can do anything, of course, in the interest of the common good, even an absolutist ruler is not in a position to change the fundamental law because it would threaten the fundament of the political system in general. So these kind of maxims of absolutist political thought were taken over from the West and provided an auxiliary legitimation, which was just secondary and subordinated to theological legitimation, because, as I mentioned, the heart of the Tsar is in God's hand still remained the cornerstone of the ideology. However, from Peter the Great after 1700, there was an increasing emphasis on gasudarstvo. So if we can take a look at the government documents, gasudarstvo and common good were the terms which were, so to say, obligatory to include in any kind of state document. And this kind of change contributed to some kind of modification of the idea of the good Tsar. So the good Tsar, after Peter, had to be also a reformer. To introduce some reform, not just to protect the poor and to punish the wicked buyers, but he had to care for the common good of the people. And the third important point that during the Petrine period, the so to say police state concept of the law was adopted. The police state at that time didn't have this kind of sinister meaning as it would sound to our ears today, because police at that time was conceived nothing else that to govern the state through the laws or with the help of laws and decrees towards the common good. But this view of the law was important because it's a kind of instrumental perception, in a sense that law was perceived as a tool of regulating society, and law was not conceived as something in its own right, that is not as something standing above the hierarchy of individuals wielding power. And the tendency that государство, that is state, the word was more and more emphasized from the early century on, and together with the commitment that legal, constitutional, and institutional limitation hinder effective government and jeopardize territorial integrity, a third point came, which has a long continuity, as I'm going to show it. Under Peter the Great, this the combination led to what is called the Russian state narrative in official ideology. It is not my term. This term was used by Richard Wortman, who wrote a book which came out in 2018 and which was very influential for my perception and for writing this book, because he wrote a book on Russian political rhetoric from the 18th century to the 21st century, and he highlighted the importance of some charismatic words. This term also comes from Professor Richard Wortman, and one charismatic word, the history of which he showed or traced, was the Celos Gasudarstva, which can be translated as integrity of the state. However, Professor Wortman remarked that this term was much more than territorial integrity, because actually it included the very strong link between territorial integrity and autocratic power, in a sense that they are interdependent. And I try to formulate it here in a way that if governmental power is divided either on a territorial basis, that is through decentralization, or by legal institutional arrangements, let's give an example, that by a parliament, it inevitably leads to quarrels, feuds, and fragmentation of the state. And this narrative was proposed for the first time by Peter's chief ideologist, Feofan Prokopovich, so he can be considered the father of the Russian state narrative. And the work in which he expounded this narrative has the title "The Justice of the Monarch's Will in Designating an Heir to His State," written in 1722, and this work is considered the new official ideology provided for Peter the Great, which used this kind of absolutist maxims which I mentioned, but without the idea of rule of law. Here, I will just very briefly give, and I'm not going to read it out to save time, some examples from the 18th and 19th century of this state narrative and the integrity of the state. The second one, which comes from Tsar Alexander II, is quoted from Richard Bertman book. By the first one I discovered in one of the tragedies, one of the plays written during the reign of Catherine the Great. So it was so widespread that even it penetrated to literary works. So what was expected of the Tsar to do, to be virtuous and to care for the integrity of the state, which of course meant that to preserve not just the territorial integrity, but to preserve the autocratic power. And here is, I think, the most emblematic quotation of this kind of perception of political power, which, due to Karamzin's influence, although this work, the Memoir of Ancient and Modern Russia, was not published during Karamzin's lifetime, however, he expanded these ideas in his monumental history of the Russian state, which became very popular in Russia in the 19th century. And the end of the quotation is the most important. Autocracy is the palladium of Russia. Its integrity is essential to her happiness. And now let's move to the epilogue. In our days, there are quite a lot of articles, either publicistic or scientific, are written in Russia or have been written in Russia on the issue, what is called in Russia государственность, which can be translated in two ways: statehood, that is the existence of a certain state in time and space, of course, and statism or stateness. And the second meaning was used in the second meaning. Was the term государственничество, used by Vladimir Putin right before he came to power for the first time as a president. And in a so-called Millennium Manifesto in 1999, he enlisted, and this speech was, speech was published also in a newspaper. He listed the most important the core values of the Russians. He mentioned, of course, patriotism. He mentioned державность, which means Russia being a great power. And he mentioned государственничество, and he expounded what государственничество means. And it is very difficult to translate it into English, but probably Richard Sakwa gave the best English translation: the sentiment of statehood. And here you can see, and colored in red, the most important points, that the state is an exceptionally important, or plays an exceptionally important role in the life of the country and its people. And he said that a strong state is not an animal, it is not something which should be fought with. Quite the contrary, it is the source and guarantor of order, the initiator and main driving force of any change. What is quite striking, that in 1988, Gorbachev made a statement which goes more or less like this: we have to exterminate from the mind of the people, or delete from the mind of the people, the idea of the good Tsar who makes order and initiates any kind of change. So it's quite the same in Putin's statement, which was remarked by Gorbachev in 1988, which I think is a good testimony of the survival of the idea of the good Tsar. And also, he many times, Putin emphasized that Russia needs a strong state, and he even used the crucial term, the integrity of the state, целостность государства. remarking that the existence of confusing laws and regulation in various levels, federal and lower levels, endangers the integrity of the state. And how important this idea is, we can see that a good book was written by Andrei Tsigankov under the title "The Strong State in Russia, Development and Crisis." And finally, just one small detail, that when Putin came to power from the second time, there were some protesters, and the protesters were officially accused of the attempt of overthrowing the state. And I think here is the link between the close association between the person wielding power, that is the president, and the idea of the state. And I also made a thorough research on the 1993 and since then many times amended constitution of the Russian Federation, that I could prove that this term, that celostnost государства, figures prominently in this document. I try to move. Okay, thanks. So I try to somehow visualize the problem of difference between the Russian perception and the Western perception. So this is a satirical print written by William Makepeace Thackeray, who is best known as a writer of his writing, The Vanity Fair. But he also made some satirical prints, and one of these satirical prints has the title Rex Ludovicus Rex on historical study. On the left side, you can see the painting of Hyacinthe Rigaud, and of course the king who is depicted is Louis XIV, the Sun King. And this painting inspired the author to make this satirical print, and also his English background, because in English from the 16th century there existed a phrase, not a phrase but an interpretation, which is known in historical literature, but it is the term which goes back to the 16th century, the king's two bodies. And Kantorovich wrote a very nice book on that in the 1950s with the title "The King's Two Bodies," which means that the king has a natural body as any other human being, as any other mortal. This body is born, this body is exposed to illnesses and so on, and once this body will die, and so dies, of course, the natural body of the king. But there is the body politic, which is none other than the crown or the state. And of course, this body politic, that is the state, the rights exercised by one given individual king, these rights never die. And with this in his mind, and with this drawing, so he kind of put it together, because on the right side, the first image is the royal ornament on a wallet, that is the rex, that is the rights of the kings in general, detached or distinguished from the person of the ruler. Then comes Ludovicus, that is Louis, as a human being, and Ludovicus Rex, that is Louis XIV as a king, embodying the body politics, so that is embodying the states. And I think this kind of satirical print is a very good example to show the difference between the Russian and the Western perception, and especially in the period within the book. Okay, something about the justification of the subtitle, because Peter, of course, Peter the Great is named in the subtitle, and I mentioned several times that I consider the turn of the 17th, 18th century as a turning point, because from that time on, roughly, there happened a revolution in national imagery. This is a title of a book written by James Crackraft, dealing with how Russian iconography and iconography of power, among others, changed during the reign of Peter the Great. And I would speak about the Petrine Revolution in vocabulary of power, which now became a real political vocabulary, not just because the adjective political was used in Russian, but because of those legal notions which I've mentioned before were integrated into the ideology of autocracy. Just very briefly, some words, because some of the issues have been mentioned before, how the vocabulary of the written sources changed. So государство was increasingly acquiring the meaning state, and during Peter's reign it was used in a sense that государство is not only different but stands above the individual ruler, and towards which the monarch has some obligation. And also I previously referred to the increasing use of the term monarch, which had, I think, long consequences that in the course of the 18th century, государство could acquire the meaning of state. Of course, most of the time during Peter, it was a rhetorical device to refer to the государство as distinct from him, or the interest of государство standing higher than the person of the ruler. Nevertheless, in the long run, it led to the result that by some authors in the mid-18th century, it really acquired state in a Western sense, which is proven by the fact that during the time of Catherine the Great in the 1780s, государство could be used in an oppositional sense, because some reformist groups claimed that there is a difference between the interest of государство and the interest of the monarch. And of course, the interest of государство, that is the interest of state, we can say, of course, can be opposed to the interest of the will of the monarch. Very interesting, of course, the visual language of power, the change in the visual language of power. So the revolution in Petrine religious imagery, and I'm going to give you some examples, and I'm going to finish on that. On the one hand, what is important that Orthodox imagery gave way to Western religious imagery. What I mean by that, for example, the triangle, of course, and the all-seeing eye in the triangle, and the radiating triangle, this iconography was clearly borrowing from Western iconography, of course, and this of course, the triangle symbolized the Holy Trinity and God-given power, but previously it practically did not exist in Austria. And also the pagan imagery is very important, because ancient mythology was banned, was forbidden by the Orthodox Church. So to use a reference to ancient gods and so on. So, for example, when in 1696, Peter, returning from his victorious Azov campaign, organized a triumphal entry, and for this occasion some triumphal gates were erected. Mars and Hercules could be seen by the audience, so it was a kind of scandal by some traditionalists that this kind of imagery was used to was used to elevate the position of the Tsar. So Mars and Hercules were not Mars. Mars and Hercules were Peter's favorite, and often he was called the Russian Hercules. And in the next slide, I will show some proof of this. And it is very important that Hercules was serving as the ruler body politic, so to say, symbolizing the burden of rulership, Hercules holding the globe. And I've had today a very exciting experience visiting Berlin when we went to see the statue of Victory, and in the neighborhood, of course, we discovered the statue of Bismarck. And in front of Bismarck, there is a figure of either Atlas or Hercules. Sometimes it is impossible to distinguish between the two, holding the globe, because it symbolized the burden of rulership. So not only rulers, but important statesmen were, so to say, elevated through these kind of iconographic means using ancient mythology. And which is also very interesting, the female allegorical personification of Russia appeared during the reign of Peter the Great, that Russia as a queen, or Russia as Minerva, for example. So these kind of allegorical personifications in the early modern Western Christendom were commonplaces from the 16th century, like the figure of Britannia, for example. And of course, these kind of allegorical personifications have a long continuity, also referring to this Bismarck statue that Germania, Germany, is standing beside Bismarck. And just a few examples from visual imagery. What you can see here is a frontispiece to the book, which is called The Emblem Book of Peter the Great, which was published in Amsterdam in 1705 with this kind of frontispiece. So in the center, you can see Peter, and there are 8 medallions. So there are 8 medallions around Peter. And very important, unlike 17th century Tsars are depicted with wearing the monomach cap and wearing kind of priestly vestments. Here, Peter is depicted without them. Peter is depicted in armor as a military leader, as an imperator, which was the original meaning of imperator. And of course, later it came to mean much more. And if you see these medallions on the upright corner, which is magnified here in Russian and also in Latin, it is written that high is the hope of your state. You can see Gasudarstvo, and in Latin, high is the hope of your empire. Also, another very important, of course, you can see the coat of arms of Russia. When this coat of arms was given an official description in 1667, it was called the state seal in Russian. In fact, of course, it was a coat of arms. But it is very important in this context that it somehow gives an idea of a distinction between the person of the ruler on the one hand and the idea of this immortal entity because of the coat of arms of Russia. And finally, below Peter, you can see Hercules holding the globe. There are 2 here, as in the other medallions, there are 2 inscriptions, in Latin and in Russian, and there is a little difference between the Latin and the Russian sentence, but very important that here the state is again present symbolically, and on the top of that through Western pagan imagery, and this figure of Hercules holding the globe, of course, refers to or symbolizes rulership as such. And there are two or more pictures, and I show it now, and really this is the end of the presentation. Yeah. On the left side, you can see the personal, the cast of the personal seal of Peter the Great. The person who is kneeling and in a guise of a mason is none other than Peter the Great, and Peter is hewing out Russia of a rough stone with the help of divine providence. There is the inscription of their adjuvante with the help of, and of course with the help of God's providence, because here we can see the radiating triangle, and of course it has some Masonic connotations as well, and there is a very good article and a book chapter written on this, on the iconography of this seal. But what I think important with regard to the person of the ruler and the state, that is the relationship between the ruler and the state. So the ruler, by and large, can form the state as he wishes, like a mason can, what a mason can do with, or a sculptor can do with his piece of work or piece of art. And on the right, you can see an engraving that that Peter presenting Russia, truth, the religion, and the arts. And Peter's presenting old Russia, so we have to pay attention to the clothes of that women, and also the position of the women with regard to Peter. And just I'm going to skip that probably, but I think this is important because in 2014 some artists depicted the 12 labors of Putin, inspired by the 12 labors of Hercules. And here is a very interesting parallel. So all the 12 labors of Hercules were depicted in one way or another. And this is the last one. You can see the enemies with whom he has to fight. With, that is the Hydra of Lerna, so to say, against Putin. But now maybe if I have 1 minute, I go back to that because why this frontispiece? Why did I change this frontispiece to this book? There were 4 or 5, I don't remember exactly, offered, but I was persuaded by my family, to be honest, because for the first time I voted for another one, but they made the right choice, and I'm very happy that this became the frontispiece. Of course, it depicts, or it is a bronze horseman, which was erected by Catherine II in memory of Peter's achievement. And it's very important that the horse and the rider imagery, either in paintings or in equestrian statues, in the earlier modern period symbolized rulership, because the horse symbolically was interpreted as the state, as the people, or the kingdom. And it is very important that on this frontispiece we have this image, which is kind of testimony to the westernization of rulership. And we have here Neptune on the right corner. Neptune, the ancient sea god, which is a testimony to the importance of ancient mythology, which was used by Petrine ideology. And finally, to finish with, in the early modern period, there was a theory of a frontispiece. Nowadays, when you go to a bookshop and you take a look at the frontispiece and the title, most of the time there is no kind of connection between the title and the frontispiece. However, in the early modern period, it was very important. I mean, the frontispiece. Think of the frontispiece of the frontispiece done to the book of Hobbes, the Leviathan. Because in the early modern period, the frontispiece had to tune the viewer to reading. That is, what is the content of the book, what to expect of the book. And also there was an expectation, and at the same time, the frontispiece had to summarize, so to say, the content of the book. And I think this kind of frontispiece summarizes the subtitle and why this kind of subtitle is written here in the title, and why precisely this image, which came from a painting at the end of the 18th century, was chosen finally as the proper frontispiece to the book. At least I hope so, that it grasps the concept of the book and the meaning of the subtitle. And thank you very much for attention. Probably it was a bit too long, probably too many mistakes in English, but I hope the message went through. Thank you very much.
Yeah, certainly the message went through, and that's why Michał is going to have to react now. So, Michał, perhaps you can swap still the feeds, so you can direct your voice into the microphone and acoustic will be better. And sorry, I need first to turn off the okay, I'm trying to do my best. Sorry. Okay. Trying to do my best. Sorry. Okay. Yeah, we've made it. Okay.
Well, thank you very much for this fascinating presentation, and thank you very much for a wonderful book indeed. I enormously enjoyed reading it. It's very consistent in its arguments. It actually, which is not obvious, answers all the questions that you put forward in the introduction. So you've done a wonderful job, and you answered a lot of questions that we all had, those who were interested in Russian history and Russian constitutional history in the early modern period and afterwards. Now, I certainly want to go, do not want to go into details of kind of questioning individual points. You're much better than me in actually answering and suggesting the evidence necessary. So that'll be fine, with only one exception, probably, perhaps, and that's the interpretation of the frontispiece of the bronze horseman. Is it actually obvious that the horse represents the subjects of the emperor's reign? I'm thinking of many other representations of emperors monarchs on horseback at the time. For example, starting with Charles the Sixth, the Holy Roman Emperor. And I don't think that in the context of the Holy Roman Empire, one would have accepted the idea of the emperor sitting on the back of his subjects. Actually, I would much rather put it in the context of military achievements. Let us remember that in that period, more and more monarchs were presented in armor. Even Elizabeth II and obviously Catherine II, and none of the two has ever wore an armor in reality. I would also draw your attention to Neptune, and that's about naval power. So, well, maybe there's a point one could think about more thoroughly. Anyway, the points I wanted to very briefly made are not meant to signal disagreement with your main argument, but there are attempts at sort of thinking further from where you are, and I'm sure you can offer a lot more interpretations in that respect, and I would simply be curious how you react to these points. Now, let me start with the parameters of your comparative approach. Now, obviously, there's no way for a single historian to carry through a comparative study on a global scale. And you deal with that issue in your introduction, and you make very good points in insisting that your comparison will be a European one. Although, however, the Ottoman Empire, or I would imagine Japan, would be wonderful cases for comparison. The Ottoman Empire, most surely, because in terms of modern state building in the 17th century, early 18th century, the Ottoman Empire was extremely advanced and often debated in Europe as a positive or a negative example of what the modernization of the state meant in that period. But fine, it would be great to have these comparisons with the Ottoman Empire or Japan or whatever, but that's not really feasible, not for a single historian. I perfectly endorse your position at that point. However, I was wondering whether one should not include into such a comparison the immediate neighbors of Russia. So your comparison is very much about Russia and the West, or the West and the rest, in the sense of highlighting the leading debates in France, in England, and to some extent in the Germans. But I'm asking myself, to what extent, what kind of role the debates and the interaction, the intellectual interaction between Russia on the one side and Polish political theory, Polish political thinking, Polish notions of what power and law is, could have played in that respect. And the same would probably be true for Sweden. I'm thinking about the very vivid debates in Sweden in the 17th century about absolute power. Not least, one should think about the Cossack question, the Cossacks, about how they kind of negotiated between Russian Gasudarstvo and the Polish model. And we all know that after all, in the 17th century, one of the visions of Cossack statehood was the idea to be included into the community of the Polish-Lithuanian nobility. They failed in trying to achieve that, and this was one of the questions why they, after all, turned to Moscow. But I'm pretty sure that that these debates in the immediate in the states immediately neighboring Russia were extremely present in Moscow or Petersburg at the time, and I would assume that they played an important role in kind of shaping Russian approaches. In your introduction, you quite rightly say that the appropriation of Western concepts is not about putting in the bag and bringing them to Moscow or Petersburg and unwrapping them, and there they are. No, it's always about traveling cultures, is always about, and you stress that quite rightly, it's about appropriation and transformation at the same time. And the Cossack world, the Ottoman Empire, Poland, Lithuania, and Sweden were as it were steps on the road between the West and Russia. And I would be curious to hear what you think about how one could kind of reconstruct the route on which the ideas traveled and concepts traveled, and to what extent Russian attempts at conceptualizing power and legitimizing power were also answers to what happened in Sweden, what happened in Lithuania at the same time. So a good question, for example, is also what kind of, let me call it, functional equivalence might have been used in Russia, functional equivalence for Western concepts. One could, for example, imagine, and I think that people like Valerie Kivelson in her studies, in her work, has produced ample evidence for that some kind of that concepts they could exist in Western Christianity, as you say, could be not replaced by Russian concepts, but by, for example, ritual. So you could have the same notion of rule and the role of the subjects without using the same word, expressing it in ritual, for example. Valerie Kivelson actually showed this impressed me a lot with the example of Chelabitia. So the ritual of bowing, in front of the Tsar, which, as she quite rightly argues, is not total submission, although the term of rab, slave, is used, but it's also about establishing some kind of mutual relationship of submission, and also of responsibility of the Tsar towards its subjects. Anyway, okay. My second point. My second point. My second point is about the spatial dimension of rule, or about territoriality of rule. That issue plays an important role in the book, and I certainly subscribe to that. It's crucial to understand how to what extent государство implied, among other issues, implied a territoriality, and if so, what kind of territory is that? How do people know what the Muscovite государство, where it is? Now, in that point, in that context, I would like to mention that Muscovite Russia became an empire before it became something like a proto-national realm. I mean, we all know, and you stress the point yourself, that a crucial turning point is the conquest of Kazan and Astrakhan. So, and at a later stage, the sort of the gradual incorporation of Siberia. So it was an empire in a way before it ever became, after the Kievan period, a corona regni in the Western European sense. There was no corona regni in Muscovite Russia. One could talk about Kievan Russia as a corona regni, but anyway, that's a different problem. Now, the question where the государство ends remained totally unclear after the emergence of Muscovite statehood. I would also stress that after Ivan III, that the idea of gathering the Russian lands did not serve as a paradigm for Muscovite and Russian politics anymore, not after Ivan III. Peter's vision of the empire, that was the rule over Persian, of the trade, over all the regions of trade between Persia and Baltic. It was an imperial concept in a rigid sense. And I can't think of any attempt at arguing in justification of the Northern War or the Azov campaign in terms of gathering the Russian land. It did not even play a role. I'm just trying to write a piece on that in the justification of the partitions of Poland. Nobody talked about the gathering of the lands anymore at that point. And certainly not Petersburg. But it's also interesting to see that, in a way, the idea of a specific notion of the Russian lands made a splendid return in the 21st century. In 2008, the Russian Foreign Ministry argued explicitly that Russia could not exist. Russia included, by definition and by necessity, both the Ukraine and the Baltic lands. That was 2008, not the most recent propaganda. So, in a way, it seems as if the kind of Russian territory as a mixture of nationalism, like official nationalism in the late 18th century, it can come back. It has to come back, as it were, in order to use a globally used political language. Another point about the spatial dimension, that's the fact that the Muscovite state, until Peter the Great, it always be surrounded by other empires. Sweden's Baltic Empire was not a nation state, obviously, and the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth was consisted mainly of non-Polish territories. So one could think of Poland-Lithuania also in terms of an empire. So in the Russian perspective of the 17th and the 18th century, in this part of the world, the principle of empire was a natural state of power and military power. So, in a way, I would also argue that the Great Northern War, or the Northern Wars, or all of the Northern Wars, were a conflict between neighboring empires, much more than between the empire here and states of a fundamentally different nature next to it. Very briefly, and I almost end here, the concept of nation. Would you say that that there perhaps was something like a functional equivalent to the idea of nationhood when we think of nation as a concept in an extremely broad sense? I'm thinking about the debate about among medievalists in the 1980s, 1990s about medieval nations or proto-nations. Benedict Jettaro has produced a lot of evidence about that, proving that indeed there was some kind of idea of nationhood, which was more, which was not merely a parallel in linguistic terms. So, and when we think of the early modern period, we know that there was something like a proto-national concept in France, the Gallia, in the Netherlands, Batavia was loaded with the ideas of physical and cultural identity and of proto-nation or Batavians, where like the Psalms, something like the essence of the elite essence of a proto-nation. So, is it true that the notions of Russia and the Russians always remained totally ambiguous, or what role played, for example, 19th century official nationalism in coining something like national identity, although it always, at the best, coexisted with the idea of orthodoxy and autocracy. So, and the last point I want to make is about absolute power. Your arguments in your book and in your presentation are perfectly waterproof in terms of analyzing what autocracy, samodzielżawia, государство meant in Russia. So I fully endorse what you said and what you wrote in your book. The only point the only question I would like to ask you in that context is, well, is there anything, was there ever anything, except for Baudin, was there ever anything like something like a codified absolutism in Europe, in the West? I don't think there ever was. I mean, it's not. In fact, Louis XIV did not say l'état-civil, for good reason he didn't say that. And after all, the concept of absolutism implies the idea of legibus solutus. Why absolutism? Because legibus solutus means totally independent from law. So is the point about absolute rule that never existed in a codified form in Western Europe, apart from the only, you mentioned in your book, you mentioned the only exception in Europe, that's Denmark, but no other European monarchy codified absolutism. Could you, for all of us, define once again what is potentially the difference between Western notions of monarchical rule in a dramatic form, in a quasi-absolutist form, and something like your genre. That's where I am. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your
Thank you very much. You are giving me a hard, difficult job, which I enjoy, of course. And thank you very much for your comments. And I think I start with the last question, and I hope I will be able to answer most of the issues raised. So, absolute monarchy and autocracy. Yes, I refer only to the 1665 royal law of Denmark, where absolute monarchy, and by the way, absolute monarchy by divine right was codified. Because when we think of absolute monarchy, we very often think absolute monarchy by divine right. However, there were authors who did not base absolute power on divine right. One exception, for example, Thomas Hobbes, of course, who based sovereignty on the contract of the individuals. So what is very important to emphasize, and I think I referred to this question, but probably I didn't go into details. By the way, this is really my favorite topic, absolutism and autocracy. So we can distinguish between different types of absolutism or absolute monarchy on the basis of the derivation of power. So in divine right, power comes to the ruler, of course, directly from God. In the case of Hobbes, it comes from to the sovereign, and it is the best thing when the sovereignty is one hand, as Hobbes argues. So it comes from the contract of the individuals, which is very different because it moves towards the consensual conception of politics. Some authors base absolute power, for example, on conquest, that the first ruler was a conqueror, and that's why everything depended afterwards on the ruler. So this derivation of power from the individuals or derivation of power from God himself directly refers to the source of power. But there is a core of absolutist ideology. We are quite punctual that the meaning of absolutus was regibus solutus. That is, the king is not subject to positive law, written law. So the king is not subject in a sense that only in the interest of the common good, the ruler is entitled to change positive law at any time without having a concept of any time or any kind of institution, like, for example, assembly of estates, or in France, absolutist ruler, absolutist thinker said that even without the concept of the parliament, which in France, the parliament was not an assembly of estates, but the court of law, which had a share in the legislation. And of course, absolute, this adjective meant not only that the ruler was above the law, but the ruler was independent of any institution outside the kingdom and inside the kingdom. But, and here comes the crucial difference, all absolute thinkers emphasize that the ruler subject to natural law, but that whatever the ruler does, it has to be in communion with natural, that is with right reason. And even, as I mentioned in my presentation, the ruler is not entitled to change the fundamental law of the country. In France, there were two fundamental laws that the king could not alienate the crown lands, let's say, and using today's phraseology, the state property, so to say. And the ruler was not entitled to change the order of succession, that is the Salic law, which prescribed male primogeniture, and according to that law, women could not claim the crown, so could not be crowned hand on the one hand, and could not transmit the right to rule. By the way, Louis XIV naturalized two of his bastard sons, but when he died, the parliament annulled, the French parliament annulled his decrees concerning that. Let's move to autocracy. In autocracy, there are no fundamental laws. And what is the kind of irony, in 1832, when for the really not for the first, but for the second time, because this 1832 definition of the ruler power in Russia relied heavily on Peter's conception, or to be more precise, what was written in the ecclesiastical regulation by Feofan Prokopovich. And in 1832, it was declared that the fundamental rule of Russia, and it reads, I try to quote it, the All-Russian Emperor is an autocratic and unlimited ruler. To obey his power out of, not only out of fear, but out of conscience, God himself commands. That's it. That was enough to justify power. There was no mention of fundamental laws, but the fundamental law of Russia was precisely that the ruler was unlimited. So this is a completely different perception. So no limit as for natural law, or no limit as for fundamental law. So that's are the most important. These are the most important issues, I would say. But it is a fact, of course, that it was only in Denmark where it was verified, but codified. But we find a lot of absolute thinkers throughout Europe, of course, who exposed these kind of ideas. Okay, probably moving from a reverse order, better to remember for me the idea of nation, or idea of nationhood. In the period, at least in the 16th, 17th century, of course, the term Ruski, which could be associated with nationhood, of course, was present. This existed. However, not in a sense as in contemporary, I would say, Western Christendom, because Ruski meant Orthodox Christian. Russian, or so to say, Russian Orthodox Christian, because the perception of the others, so to say, was religious, was not so much cultural, but religious. So Lutheranism was the German faith. Islam was the Tatar faith, so to say. So in that sense, I don't think that any kind of parallel existed, because a self-perception, self-identity was inherently religious. And you mentioned this in connection with nationhood, the official nationality that in 1832, Uvarov formulated a triad of orthodoxy, autocracy, and narodnost in Russian, which is translated as nationhood, but probably the better translation is peoplehood. But precisely it was the third point, or the third term, which was very difficult to explain, because there were some, so to say, ideologists in quotation mark who explained what narodnost, peoplehood, means, and by and large, they said that the Russians have a very emotional attitude to autocracy and orthodoxy, and that is the essence of narodnost, that is peoplehood, which again goes back to the importance of the religious perception, that religious self identity, and if you like, to the difference between Western political ideas and system, because we should not forget that orthodoxy, autocracy, and peoplehood were formulated in a way because it was a reaction to the triad of the French Revolution. So that is very important to keep in mind. Okay, so let's begin then with the first question, with the frontispiece and the portraits and Neptune. You are quite right that Neptune also means the sea power, and that was one of the reasons for choosing this. But of course, it is important from the point of view of the pagan imagery. Your remark is well chosen, of course, not just this one, but the others as well, as for the equestrian portraits and statues. Sometimes, of course, it is difficult to decide, because art historians speak three types of equestrian portrait in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th century. You mentioned Charles V, and it's very important because Charles is depicted, the emperor is depicted as a Christian knight. So what is important, the warrior type. But also there is some kind of imperial type. For example, Charles I, King of England, was depicted under an archway. Of course, a clear reference to Roman imperial iconography. And there is a third, rulership type, so to say, which I emphasized in this. But of course, sometimes the imperial type, that is a military aspect, and the rulership aspect are both present in this kind of equestrian portrait. And maybe it's a matter of taste, a matter of choice, which one or other author wants to emphasize. But there is no doubt about it that then there can be more than one interpretation. Okay, the impact of immediate neighbors. I also write in a book that in 1716, when Peter issued his military regulation, then he used the phraseology of the Swedish Diet of 1693, and this was precisely the diet which proclaimed that the King of Sweden is a hereditary and absolute ruler, and there was almost a word-by-word translation by Peter in 1716 in one point. As for Poland, of course, very important. Poland was very important because of the borrowing of political vocabulary, the phraseology. I also mentioned in my book, relying mostly on the research of Sergei Polskoy, who has written a very nice article how these kind of Western terms and concepts were interiorized, so to say, during the 18th century. In the first 2 decades, he says that until the 1720s, very often the Russian author or the translators couldn't do just replace some terms with Polonism. So they didn't translate it, but transliterated, for example, the Rzeczpospolita, they just really transliterated it into Russian because they couldn't do anything with it. And of course, it took times for 2 or 3 decades that they wanted to find Russian equivalents for them. And by the way, the Poland-Lithuania, the Polish-Lithuania of Commonwealth was a bad example for Russia because of the because of the incompetence of the ruler, so to say. So in the new ideology, von Prokopovich, the work to which I refer to in my presentation in 1722, when he enlisted the advantages and disadvantages of elective monarchies and hereditary monarchies, of course, Poland-Lithuania was a bad example. For understandable reasons. So it was not a good example for a strong state, for a strong monarchy type of government. Okay, petitioning and the achievements of Valery Kivazon. Yes, I quote her on many occasions, and it's very and petitioning was very important. As I mentioned in the presentation, that everyone had the right to submit a petition to the Tsar until the mid-17th century, even personally. Then it was banned to do it personally. However, there is a difference between my interpretation and Valery Kivazon and Nancy Steele-Koltzman, who are one of the greatest historians of that period. I emphasize it, and I try to make it very straight, so to say, that I am approaching Russia from a different angle. So there is a, so to say, the hard school, or a hard school and a soft school. So these distinguished colleagues belong to the soft school, emphasizing some similarities. There are some similarities, no doubt. But for me, to explain why perception of state and many other things was different, we have to look at the differences. So that's why, besides, of course, not denying, of course, the importance of similarities. And of course, it is, I completely agree that because of the lack of these institutions in Russia, rituals were much more important. Rituals much more important in Russia, although they were very important in Western Christendom. For example, as Edvard Muir, in his also wonderful book, Ritual in Early Modern Europe, remarked that, or there is a chapter, the government as a ritual process. So it was very important everywhere, but I agree that it was even more important in Russia. However, and of course, that the right of petition was possessed by the subjects, and also I many times refer in my book that the word subject, which is a Polish loan word in the Russian, poddanny, also it was known from the early 17th century. It is not encountered in the 1649 law book, where one should expect to appear, and only in the second half of the 18th century this abstract word is used. So the right of petitioning, from the right of petitioning, I would not draw the conclusion of mutuality. Mutuality for me implies the idea of a kind of contract between the ruler and the ruled. So mutual responsibilities, so to say, and not just mutual responsibilities, but mutual rights, so to say. As for the territoriality, yes, this is a very difficult question. the idea of territoriality, and also Valery Kiberson has written a wonderful book on the use of maps. It is for the first time in the 17th century, but the systematic map making begins only during the reign of Peter the Great after 1700, which is a kind of awareness of the territoriality. I think it cannot be separated from the use of the word gasudarstvo somehow. I think I've covered, if I'm not mistaken, all the points. If not, please please remind me.
Yes, thank you. You have answered.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, but we have still about 5 minutes left. Yeah, so the reaction of the audience is still positive. No, we've exceeded our time limit. Nonetheless, it was the debate between both of you, your presentation first, and the debate between both of you was really fascinating. So, are there any comments, any questions from the audience? Oh, I can't see anything. So let me ask you the very last question, because we were talking about the transfer of the cultural patterns and contents between the West and the East, between Western Europe and Russia. And I just wonder about the translations of the West European literature, perhaps even some Polish words, into Russian in the late 17th or in the 18th centuries. So, to what extent the West European political thought was went into the Russian world through the translations from the West European languages into Russian.
Okay, just to give one example, for example, the work of Samuel Pufendorf, the history of the states of Europe was translated into Russian, which was very important for Russian bookmen during the Petrine period. But Peter, of course, placed a great emphasis on the translation of Western works, which were mostly done by those Ukrainians coming from Kiev, because they have the language capacity. It was very so. Feofan Prokopovich was a Ukrainian, was the director of the Kievan Academy, and he produced the new official ideology justifying the unlimited power of the monarch. And most of the translators also came from Kiev, because they, as I mentioned, the language capacity, they knew Ukrainian, they knew Polish, they knew Latin, they knew some other European languages. So actually, and what is also very important, and not so much mentioned, that Peter the Great replaced not only abolished the Patriarchate in 1721, but he replaced the church hierarchy. More than 70% of the bishops by the end of his reign were of Ukrainian religion. So much of what he did in terms of changing the status of the church or vis-a-vis the rural, for example, he heavily relied on people coming from Ukraine, because as I mentioned, the intellectual capacity was really with them. And as for translations, later in a later period, especially the second half of the 18th century is very important. And there is a very good website also created by Sergei Polskoy. It is called the Corpus of Russian Translations. Because it gives parallel, for example, the French text of the encyclopedia, for example, and also the Russian translations. But most of these translations are predominantly from the second half of the century, especially during the reign of Catherine the Great. Of course, there are from the previous decades, but this is the great upsurge of all these translations.
Very much. So thank you for your participation in the debate. Thank you to the audience for your presence and listening to what was going on here on the stage. And I hope and that you are satisfied with
of course
the debate.
Thanks.
of you, Michael. Yeah, your facial expression says everything about our job. Thank you to everyone, and we're going to continue this format, the triangle of dialogue. Berlin, Prague, and Warsaw in the nearest future. And the recording of this event will be soon available in one of our YouTube channels. Thank you very much.